What happens when the system that governs your land forgets who owns it? What do you do when the rules are written by those who trespass and still demand you move? This isn't just a story about a cabin. It's about power, illusion, and the moment when truth redraws a map. It started with a letter, thin, official, and quietly threatening. The kind of letter that doesn't shout, but whispers with authority. From the HOA. A request, they called it. A demand, I read it as. They wanted me to move my cabin 20 feet, not because it was unsafe, not because it violated any law, but because it disrupted their aesthetic, their symmetry, their illusion of control. I held the letter in my hands, standing inside the cabin I had built with my own sweat, my own hands, my own time. And I asked myself, who decides where a home belongs? Is it the one who builds it, or the one who governs the land around it? My cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory. It was defiance. It was a refusal to conform to a grid I never agreed to. I looked out the window, past the trees, past the gravel path, past the street that curved like a question mark. And I saw it. Houses lined up like soldiers, neat and identical, their driveways cutting through what used to be mine. I had known, vaguely, that the HOA's reach was wide, but I hadn't realized it was invasive, that their street, paved, polished, praised, was built on my land, not metaphorically, literally. I pulled out the survey maps, the old ones, the ones that still smelled like ink and dust. And there it was, my boundary, my line, my truth, their street sliced through it like a blade. And I thought, how many systems demand obedience while standing on stolen ground? How many institutions ask you to move while refusing to acknowledge their own trespass? The cabin was never the problem. It was a symbol, the reminder that not everything can be regulated, that not every space can be absorbed into a plan. I walked outside, stood on the porch, and felt the weight of the letter in my pocket. It didn't scare me. It clarified me. Because when someone asks you to erase yourself for their comfort, you don't comply, you confront. I didn't build the cabin to provoke, but provocation is often the byproduct of truth. And truth, once uncovered, doesn't retreat. It expands. It demands. It disrupts. The HOA wanted symmetry. I wanted sovereignty. And between those two desires stood a cabin, unmoved, unyielding, unapologetic. It arrived folded, stamped, and sterile, an envelope that carried no emotion, only instruction. The kind of paper that doesn't bleed but cuts. HOA letterhead at the top, printed in a font that mimics authority but lacks soul. It didn't ask, it informed. Your cabin must be relocated 20 feet to comply with community standards. No explanation, no dialogue, just decree. And I stared at it, not with confusion but with recognition. Because bureaucracy doesn't shout, it whispers with precision. It doesn't confront, it encroaches. And this letter was an encroachment, not on my land, but on my autonomy, on the idea that ownership is not just legal, it's existential. I didn't build my cabin to be compliant. I built it to be rooted, to be mine. And now, a piece of paper was trying to uproot it, not with bulldozers, with language, with clauses, with the quiet violence of policy. I read the letter again, slowly, tracing each word like a scar. Community standards. Whose community? Whose standards? I hadn't joined their HOA. I hadn't signed their covenant. I hadn't agreed to their aesthetic. And yet, here they were, asserting dominion over what they didn't own. I pulled out my deed, my survey, my title. I compared lines, borders, coordinates. And the truth was clear. Their street ran through my property. Not metaphorically. Literally. Asphalt laid over my soil. Sidewalks poured across my boundary. And yet, they wanted me to move. As if their trespass gave them leverage. As if their mistake gave them authority. I thought about the irony. How systems built on error often demand correction from others. How institutions rarely apologize, but often instruct. And I felt the weight of that paper grow heavier. Not physically, philosophically. Because this wasn't just a letter. It was a test, a challenge, a provocation. Would I comply for peace or resist for principle? I folded the letter, not to hide it, but to contain it, to keep its edges from slicing deeper. And I knew this wasn't about 20 feet. It was about power, about who gets to draw the lines, about who gets to enforce illusion as truth. The letter was precise, but truth is messy, and I was ready to embrace the mess, to unfold the illusion, to respond, not with silence, but with sovereignty. I unfolded the survey map like a relic, its creases worn from years of quiet relevance. It wasn't just paper, it was proof, a document that didn't speak loudly, but spoke clearly, lines drawn not by opinion, but by measurement, coordinates etched into the earth long before the HOA paved over them. I traced the boundary with my finger, slowly, deliberately, as if touching truth itself. My land extended farther than I remembered, farther than they acknowledged, and there it was, the street, their street, running like a scar through my property. Not a mistake, a decision, a trespass disguised as progress. I felt something shift inside me, not rage, but revelation, because when you see the map, you see the lie, the illusion of authority, the fiction of control. They had built their world on my soil, and now they wanted me to move, not because I was wrong, because I was inconvenient, because my cabin disrupted their narrative. But the map didn't lie. It didn't bend to preference. It didn't care about aesthetics. It cared about truth, and truth, once revealed, doesn't retreat. It expands. It demands recognition. I took the map to the county office, laid it on the counter, and watched the clerk's eyes widen. "This is your land," she said. "All of it." And I nodded, not with pride, but with clarity, because clarity is power, not the kind that dominates, the kind that defends, the kind that says, "I belong here." I asked for copies, certified, stamped, irrefutable, and I carry them home like armor, because when systems forget your boundaries, you must remind them, not with anger, with evidence, with the quiet force of fact. I pinned the map to my wall, next to the letter, 2 documents, 2 realities, 1 truth, and I thought, how many people are displaced by systems that never bother to check the map? How many homes are erased by policies built on assumption? How many truths are buried beneath asphalt and ordnance? My cabin wasn't in the way. Their street was. And I wasn't the trespasser. I was the witness, the reminder, the disruption. And I knew the map would speak louder than any letter, because boundaries, once revealed, don't just protect. They provoke. They challenge the illusion. They redraw the story. And I was ready to tell mine. They called it a community review. I called it a reckoning, a gathering of HOA board members, seated behind a long table like judges in a courtroom they built themselves. Their expressions were rehearsed, polite, firm, faintly condescending. I walked in with my map rolled under my arm, and my resolve sharpened like a blade. They began with pleasantries. I didn't reciprocate, because this wasn't a conversation. It was a confrontation. They spoke of harmony, of uniformity, of standards. I spoke of ownership, of boundaries, of truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, disrupts performance. I laid the map on the table, slowly, deliberately, and watched their eyes shift, not in surprise, in discomfort, because discomfort is what happens when illusion meets evidence. "This is my land," I said. "Your street runs through it." Silence. Then deflection. "We were told the easement was approved." I nodded. "By whom?" They hesitated, because systems often rely on assumption, not verification. I pointed to the coordinates, the surveyor's stamp, the county records. "This isn't a request," I said. "It's a correction." One of them leaned forward, trying to soften the moment. "We understand your concern, but the cabin still disrupts the visual flow of the neighborhood." And I laughed, not out of humor, but out of clarity. "You paved a street through my land, and now you want to move my home for your visual flow?" Their faces tightened, because truth, when unyielding, is offensive to those who benefit from fiction. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the stakes. "If you want to discuss relocation," I said, "start with your street." They murmured among themselves, the illusion fracturing in real time, because power, when confronted with precision, loses its grip. They tried to pivot, to policy, to precedent, to politeness. But I held the line, literally, figuratively, philosophically. This cabin stays, I said. And if you want to challenge that, you'll need more than a letter. You'll need a courtroom. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with retreat. They folded their papers. I rolled up my map, and as I walked out, I felt a shift not in them, but in me, because resistance isn't just about winning. It's about refusing to disappear, about refusing to let bureaucracy rewrite your story, about standing, even when the system expects you to yield. And I knew the cabin wasn't just unmoved. It was undeniable. They didn't speak at first, not during the meeting, not after the letter, not when the cabin stood firm and the HOA's authority began to crack. My neighbors, those who live in the houses built on the street that slice through my land, watched from behind curtains, from porches, from driveways. Their silence was palpable, not empty, loaded, because silence, in moment of tension, is never neutral. It's a choice, a position, a side. I walked past them daily, nodding, waiting, wondering. Would they ask? Would they acknowledge? Would they stand beside me, or behind the system that paved their comfort over my sovereignty? One neighbor, an older man with a weathered face and a cautious gait, finally spoke. I didn't know, he said, about the land, about the cabin, about the street. I nodded. Most don't, and that's the problem. Systems thrive on ignorance, on assumptions, on the quiet agreement that what's built must be rightful. But construction doesn't equal consent, and silence doesn't equal support. Another neighbor, younger, sharper, more defensive, said, "But the street's been here for years. It's part of the neighborhood." I looked at him calmly. "So is my land." He frowned, because truth, when inconvenient, is often met with resistance, not because it's wrong, because it disrupts comfort. And comfort is sacred in suburban spaces. The illusion of order, the performance of harmony, the choreography of compliance. My cabin disrupted that, not with noise, with presence, with refusal, with truth. And truth, when visible, demands response. Some neighbors began to shift, not loudly, subtly, a wave, a nod, a question. "Is it true?" they asked. "Did they really build the street on your land?" I showed them the map, the deed, the evidence, and I watched their faces change, from doubt to discomfort, from discomfort to recognition, because recognition is a first step toward accountability, not institutional, personal, the kind that says, "I live here, I benefit from this, I need to understand it." Not all responded. Some stayed silent. Some stayed loyal to the HOA. But silence, once broken, spreads. It creates cracks. It invites questions. It challenges allegiance. And I knew the neighbors weren't just witnesses. They were participants in the trespass, in the silence, in the reckoning. And their silence, once shattered, became a side. Not against me, against illusion. Before the cabin, before the street, before the HOA, there was a land, untouched, unclaimed, unregulated. A stretch of soil and stone that held no allegiance to symmetry or ordinance. I inherited it from my grandfather, who inherited it from his father, who carved the original boundary with nothing but a compass and conviction. The deed was old, handwritten, notarized in ink that had faded but not disappeared. It spoke of ownership not as transaction, but as stewardship. And I thought, how many conflicts begin when history is ignored, when the past is paved over in favor of convenience? The HOA didn't ask about the land's origin. They didn't consult the archives. They built forward, assuming backward. An assumption is the first betrayal of truth. I spent nights poring over records, county filings, land surveys, zoning shifts. And I saw it. The slow erosion of recognition. How my boundary was redrawn on maps that prioritized development over accuracy. How easements were granted without consent. How the street was justified by a clause buried in a document I never signed. And I realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. A system that forgets what doesn't serve its purpose. My cabin was inconvenient. My deed was outdated. My presence was disruptive. But disruption is often the only way history speaks. I found letters from my grandfather, correspondence with the county, objections to early zoning proposals, warnings about encroachment. He saw it coming. He tried to stop it. But systems don't listen to lone voices. They listen to momentum. And momentum favors aloud the organized, the funded. The HOA had all three. I had memory. And memory, when documented, becomes resistance. I compiled everything: maps, letters, deeds, objections. I created a timeline, a narrative, a truth, because truth, when layered, becomes undeniable. I presented it to the board, not as a plea, as a reckoning. You didn't just build on my land, I said. You erased its story. They blinked. They shifted. They deflected. But deflection doesn't erase documentation. It delays accountability. And I wasn't interested in delay. I was interested in restoration, not of soil, of respect, of recognition. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And I chose to remember everything. Every line, every letter, every warning, every silence. And I knew the conflict wasn't new. It was inherited. And I was ready to resolve it, not with compromise, but with clarity. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a hallway, a corridor outside the county zoning office, where two officials whispered over my documents like students caught cheating on a test they didn't study for. I had submitted everything: maps, deeds, letters, timelines, not as a protest, as a mirror. And mirrors, when held up to systems, don't flatter. They reveal. One official, younger, eager to deflect, said, "This must be a clerical error." I nodded. Then why did it survive 15 years? The other, older, quieter, said nothing, because silence in the face of exposure is often the first admission. I watched them scan the documents, trace the lines, reread the coordinates. And I saw it, the moment when illusion collapses. Not loudly, internally. The HOA had built its authority on assumption, on the belief that no one would question the foundation. But foundations, when cracked, don't hold. And mine was no longer cracked. It was exposed. I requested a formal review, a public hearing, a chance to speak, not just to the board, but to the system that had paved over my truth. They granted it, reluctantly, because exposure is contagious. It spreads. It infects. It forces systems to see themselves, not as they claim to be, but as they are. The hearing was quiet. No cameras, no press, just officials, papers, and the weight of contradiction. I spoke slowly, deliberately, without theatrics. "You built a street on my land," I said, "then asked me to move my home to preserve your illusion." They shifted. They scribbled. They sighed. But they didn't deny. Because denial, once exposed, becomes absurd. I presented the timeline, the maps, the letters, the silence, and I asked, what happens when the system is wrong? Not rhetorically, literally, because systems rarely prepare for their own failure. They prepare for resistance, for protest, for noise, but not for precision, not for truth, not for exposure. One official finally spoke. "We'll need to reevaluate the easement." And that sentence, so simple, so overdue, was a crack. The beginning of accountability, not resolution. Recognition, because recognition is a first step toward repair. The HOA didn't attend. They sent a statement, a paragraph of deflection. But deflection doesn't survive exposure. It evaporates. And I knew the system had seen itself, not in my words, in its own reflection. And once seen, it couldn't unsee. The cabin remained. The street remained. But the illusion was gone. And in its place stood truth, unfolded, undeniable, unyielding. The cabin still stands, not just physically, but symbolically, a structure that refused to move, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. The street still curves through my land, a scar that no longer hides beneath the surface. And the HOA, once confident, once unquestioned, now walks with caution. Their letters have stopped. Their meetings are quieter. Their authority, once assumed, now feels borrowed. But this story isn't about victory. It's about legacy, about what remains after the illusion is broken. I walk the perimeter of my land often now, not to defend it, but to remember it, to remember that ownership is more than paperwork. It's presence. It's history. It's the refusal to be erased. The neighbors wave more now. Some stop to talk. Some ask questions. And I answer, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because clarity, once earned, becomes a gift, a way to teach, a way to warn, a way to say, this happened, don't let it happen again. The cabin has become a landmark, not on any map, in memory, in narrative, in resistance. I receive letters from others, people who face similar erasures, similar demands, similar silences. They ask how I stood. I tell them, with truth, with documentation, with a refusal to disappear, because disappearance is what systems expect. Quiet compliance, passive surrender. But legacy is built on refusal, on the decision to say, no, I belong here. And belonging, once claimed, becomes contagious. It spreads. It inspires. It redefines. The county has begun reviewing old easements, not because they want to, because they have to, because exposure demands reform. And reform begins with recognition. The cabin hasn't changed, but everything around it has. The narrative, the power dynamic, the silence. And I know this story will outlive the conflict. It will become a lesson, a warning, a mirror, because when illusion breaks, truth doesn't just emerge, it endures. And I will endure with it, not as a protester, as a witness, as a reminder. That land remembers, that history speaks, that silence, once broken, becomes legacy.